Good afternoon and a warm welcome to AI Influencers and Milgram's Secret, Why Social Psychology Matters Right Now with Dr. Paul Dickerson. Can I quickly check that everyone can hear me okay? Yep. My name is Camille Richmond and I'm the marketing manager for Sage Psychology. I'm a cisgender woman. I have brown hair, hazel eyes and pale skin. I'm wearing a black dress and my pronouns are she and her. I'm joined by my colleague Maria, who will be part of the Q&A a little later on. Before we start, and as everyone gets settled in, I'd like to mention a bit of webinar housekeeping. We've switched off the cameras and muted the microphones for all participants except the presenters. This is so that everyone will be able to enjoy the session without any background noise. The chat box won't be available during this webinar. We would, however, love to hear from you, so you can write any questions you may have for Paul in the Q&A box and upvote other attendees' questions. There will be a chance for questions after the presentation. You can also use closed captions by clicking the Show Captions button on your screen, which will make them appear. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the Sage YouTube channel over the next few weeks. We'll also share it via email and on our Twitter X account @Sage Psychology. So we are Sage Psychology. We are rooted in the beliefs that research matters, education changes lives, and equitable access to quality content is essential. Sage Psychology collaborates with our authors and editors to create meaningful learning resources and experiences. We understand the part that we have to play in moving the discipline forward and the impact this will have on society and the world at large. It's our absolute pleasure to be hosting today's webinar, which celebrates the publication of the second edition of Social Psychology, Traditional and Critical Perspectives by Dr. Paul Dickerson. This book brings an analytical lens to the core topics, interrogating classic studies, exploring real-world cases, and addressing key issues such as climate change, activism, and AI. We're thrilled to be offering a 25% discount to you on the book with the code DICKERSO25, which is valid on sagepub.co.uk and ebooks.com. For any faculty who are attending, if you requested your inspection copy of the book when you signed up for the webinar, you'll be getting your electronic copy in the next week. I'm now delighted to introduce you to our author. So Dr. Paul Dickerson is Associate Professor at the University of Roehampton, where he has taught for more than 25 years. His research has predominantly adopted a qualitative approach and has largely focused on issues of talk and interaction. He's previously written best-selling How to Write Brilliant Psychology essays, also published by us, which some of you may already be familiar with. Paul has written Social Psychology Second Edition to enable you to immerse yourself in the exciting world of social psychology, see its relevance in everyday life, as well as to support you in questioning its findings. So that's all from me. I'll stop sharing my slides now, and it'll be over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much for that. I'm just going to switch so I can share. Oops. Great. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing my slides now. And I would just like to follow on from that wonderful introduction, if I may. I am Paul Dickerson. I'm the author, with a lot of help from my friends at Sage, of this book, Social Psychology, Traditional and Critical Perspectives, the second edition. And in terms of self-descriptors, I don't know why I need to read from a list of my descriptions describing myself. I think it's to keep the old script in case I get it wrong. I'm a cisgendered male. I have pronouns he, his. I have a beard, glasses, long brown hair, blue eyes. I'm wearing a blue jacket with a white shirt. Okay, I hope that description is accurate and fits what you're perceiving as well. I'm delighted to join this webinar and to look at something that I think is really important. And in a way, in our journey today, I'd like to touch base with Milgram, then move out to some contemporary dimensions of social influence, and then maybe move back to Milgram and then think, well, what's it all about? So if you've got any of those questions or more, I hope there'll be something in this for you. Okay, so AI influences a Milgram secret, why social psychology matters right now. And what I think might be a good idea is if you just keep in the back of your mind, what is this secret? And some of you might know, some of you might not know, but it'd be very interesting. You just keep that thought and see if there's some clues along the way. Okay, so this is what we're going to cover, which I've kind of briefly outlined: Milgram's take on social influence, then some other more contemporary dimensions of social influence, then back to Milgram, and at last the reveal of Milgram's secret, and some stuff about the importance of curiosity. Okay, so there's our friend Milgram, his Milgram and his apparatus, which, let's just make a note of this, now looks very much like you'd get it in some sort of specialist antique shop. At that time, in the early and mid and then later 1960s, that would have looked quite impressive, actually. That would look like a very expensive amplifier or something like that, quite specialist equipment, maybe specialist recording equipment, but it wouldn't be something that everyone comes across all the while, and it wouldn't have that sense of old tech, which we have when we look at it now. This is just the rough setup of Milgram's experiment, and we can see we've got an experimenter. The experimenter is the one telling the real subject to carry on administering shocks. The subject is the one who, in various ways, depending on which version of the experiment we're looking at, there were over 20 versions of Milgram's obedience studies, but the subject has taken part in the experiment, doesn't know that there's some trick going on, believes that it's a learning experiment, and that they're going to have to administer electric shocks using that apparatus, increasing the voltage level every time the learner gets the wrong answer. There's a lot of levers on that board, but there's also a lot of questions that the learner is going to be asked. Okay, so the fake test subject is sitting here. Now, where they're sitting, where they're located, actually does depend on which variation of the 20+ experiments we're looking at. I'm taking the same baseline that Milgram did, which is experiment number 5. That was what Milgram called his new baseline experiment. And that means he compares all the other results to this one, the baseline. Now, the fake test subject pretends to experience pain when the subject depresses a lever which they are led to believe administers a shock. So it's a learn, as far as the participant is concerned, the real subject participant, as far as they're concerned, they're trying to help with a study into learning, and they're going to administer some sort of punishment in terms of an electric shock every time the learner gets the wrong answer. And each time they get it wrong, the next time they're going to go up by 15 volts. And some of you might know at the top level, it's not 240 volts that I've got coming out of the wall just here, it's 450 volts. And there's a little sign next to it, danger, XXX severe shock, just in case you didn't quite cop on that that's a lot of volts being administered. Here's someone, this is the learner in one of the conditions, being strapped into the seat, ready to receive the shocks. One of the learners, the learner in the baseline condition, actually complains of a heart condition when they're being strapped in. Let's have a quick look at Milgram then. And he was very keen to say that the first thing he did was to consult expert opinion, find out what psychiatrists predicted. Here's one. Most subjects will not go beyond 150 volts, and the consensus of the psychiatrist was that only a pathological fringe of about 1 in 1,000 will administer the highest shock on the board. So from Milgram's point of view, the psychiatrist is saying you're not going to get much here. And indeed, some participants, including this man pictured here, did not obey. They ducked out at an earlier stage. Milgram was interested in how many not just administered one shock or two, but went all the way up to the maximum number of shocks on the board, 450 volts. This guy jumped out early, refused to go on. This lady did as well, Brandt, who Milgram discusses in some detail in his 1974 book, reflecting on his research. Here she's saying, well, I'm sorry, I don't think we should continue. That's at 210 volts. The experimenter who keeps nudging the participants to continue, the experiment requires that you go on until he has learned all the word pairs correctly. She replies, he has a heart condition. I'm sorry, he told you that before. The shocks may be painful, but they're not dangerous. Well, I'm sorry, says the participant. I think when shocks continue like this, they are dangerous. You ask him if he wants to get out. It's his free will. It's absolutely essential that we continue, says the experimenter. I'd like you to ask him. We came here of our free will. If he wants to continue, I'll go ahead. I don't want to be responsible for anything happening to him. I wouldn't like it for me either. And when we look at that, I think, oh, a little bit more here, actually. You have no other choice. I think we're here on our own free will. I don't want to be responsible if anything happens to him. Please understand that. And when you look at that, and I know this experiment well, some of you know this experiment well, I like to think that I would be more or less like this woman who, in her participation, got to a level and said no more. Okay, she refused to go on. The experiment is terminated. And as Milgram says, we all really want to imagine that we would be like this. But were participants like this? Rather famous participant pictured here, used in a lot of Milgram's documentaries about his series of experiments. Fred Prosy. He showed concerns from delivering the 180 volts shock, shaking his head as he addresses the experimenter, getting more and more agitated. At 315 volts, there's even more concern. Here, this is taken from the documentary. The Milgram filmed many of these experiments. This is Fred in some state of anguish. Here he's talking, this is around the 315 volt mark. Relieved to hear a response. Next one, the learner shouts out, I absolutely refuse to answer. You get a shock if you don't answer. Poor old Fred, that's how he looks. That's what he's doing at that moment. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering at less voltage. Can you check in and see if he's all right, please? The experimenter with the same detached calm throughout. Not once we've started. Please continue, teacher. Prosy sits down, sighs deeply. Cool, day, shade, water, paint. So just to reiterate, the participant is, in theory, the teacher, is delivering these word pairs, and the learner is supposed to respond with the correct pairing. Cool, day, shade, water, paint. Answer, please. You're right in there. Are you all right? So poor old Fred Prosy getting more and more concerned here, as we can see. The experimenter nudging, continuation. Please continue, teacher. Continue, please. The subject, that's Fred Prosy, the participant, pushes the lever. Zzz. He swivels around in his chair now. Something's happened to that man in there. You better check in on him, sir. He won't answer or nothing. This is what he's doing at the time he's saying that. Continue. Go on, please. You accept all responsibility? The responsibility is mine, correct. Please go on. The subject races through. If you've seen the documentary, you'll see this. He absolutely could not read this any faster if you tried. Goes through all the word pairs as rapidly as he can, gets to the 450 volts, does that. Okay, and just to say, it wasn't quite that, because Milgram designed the experiment so that the 450 volts, once you got there, you had to keep administering that voltage until very abruptly the experimenter says, I'm sorry, we'll have to discontinue the experiment there. You might also have noticed that, although I have edited this down to make it a bit easier to read, before administering the volts, the teacher, that's the real participant, announces the voltage that is being applied. I think that's quite a clever design of Milgram. So people can't just say, oh, they weren't aware, you know, they're just pressing the buttons. They didn't really know. No, you actually have to say the voltage, which is quite interesting. Now let's have a little look at some summary findings. the baseline condition. That's the one I'm describing, experiment number 5, Milgram's new baseline. The mean voltage wasn't down at 100 odd volts, as some had predicted, 370 volts, pretty lethal. STL means shock to the limit. STL, 63% obedience. That was counted as the obedience figure. That's people who not only get to 450, but keep pressing that each time they are asked to by the experimenter, 63%. If you switch it around and the subject chooses whatever voltage they want to give, average is 45 volts, only 2.5% shock to the limit. If you switch up the personalities, make the learner receiving the volts a little bit less pleasant, make the experimenter a little bit less bossy, it brings it down a little bit, 50% going to the limit. Move it out of the university, have a commercial setting, 48%. For the big changes, though, it's these around these. Subject choice, which I've already noted, proximity, actually bringing the learner in next to the teacher so that you see a physical person there. You don't just hear protests and banging on a wall. 30%, more than half drop. How about if a fellow participant like you, not this expert, not this authority figure of the experimenter, but a fellow participant offers instruction, only 20% obedience. Orders by phone reduced to 21%. Let's have a look at some of the attempts to dismiss these findings. Okay, so firstly, were they weird subjects? Secondly, was it just not believable that they're administering shocks? And thirdly, was the setting somehow unrealistic? Let's have a little look at each of those in turn. I'm going to be really quick here. The participants didn't seem that weird. There were various replications. Milgram did 20-odd replications. Others did numerous replications. Milgram was really keen to get it off the campus, to somewhat widen the demographic of participants, to get a wider spectrum. And his comment was that the experimental outcome was largely the same. There's been numerous replications since. The picture is a little bit more complex, but a large number have shown a replication of findings. There is also, of course, now a contamination effect in that many, many people are aware of Milgram's research through film. There is also a sort of a pop record. I'm not sure it was very popular actually, but there is actually a record, Milgram's 37, if you're interested. Peter Gabriel was involved in that. There's a lot of knowledge about Milgram, and that does contaminate the extent to which it can be regularly replicated. So a lot of people seem to, as far as we can tell, come up with something similar. Was there disbelief? Well, one of the things Milgram was keen on showing, not only when we look at like Fred Prosey's reactions, but also in the interviews after. Here, the experiment, this is with the participants. At what point were you most tense or nervous? Mr. Braverman says, that was I'm a nice person, I think, hurting somebody and caught up in what seems a mad situation. And in the interest of science, one goes through with it. Interesting, that reference to science, just maybe make a mental note of that. We might pick up on that a little bit later. But the interviews, as well as some of the filmed responses, at least the ones that are widely available, suggested some measure of belief. Were the settings weird? Well, I think, to be honest, they probably were, and I think Milgram acknowledges that, but his argument is that the key dynamics of someone in charge telling you what to do is not that weird. So this dynamic of authority, subordinate, and so on, Milgram argues that that is realistic, even if the particulars of the circumstance are unrealistic. Are there alternative explanations? There are. Some people came up with the idea of aggressive tendency. Well, there's a bit of a snag, because do you remember how low the levels of obedience were when participants could choose their own shock levels, something like 2.5% going all the way to the 450 volts when they chose their own shock level? If there's an aggressive tendency, if anything, then wouldn't everyone jump on the 450 volts and start going wild from the beginning? Personality factors, I think that's a bit snaggy. You can see the relevance of personality factors, easy go-to explanation. One of the snags with that, though, is the numbers. Milgram quite often found around 2/3 participants, shocking all the way to the limit. We're up for a poll question now, so I'd be very interested to hear your responses to this. And this is the question: what was the main... Sorry, I've got to move. The poll has come up in front of my screen. What's the main theory that Milgram drew on to make sense of the findings in his obedience experiments? What was the main theory? And we've got 4 to choose from: role theory, agentic state, social identity theory, cognitive dissonance. I'd be very interested to hear what your thoughts are. So the question: what's the main theory that Milgram drew on to make sense of the findings in his obedience experiments? And was it role theory, agentic state, social identity theory, or cognitive dissonance? Okay, well, I see the results are in, and role theory is not getting any votes here. Cognitive dissonance is getting 20%, and in first place, joint equal, agentic state and social identity theory. Well, I think that's very interesting and very insightful responses there, so very well done. Thank you for voting. The right answer, in that it's the one that Milgram drew on, is agentic state. So well done. But if you put in one of the other ones, I think you are onto something. So please don't feel bad, because that's going to be relevant as we move forward. Okay, so Milgram's own early explanations, as I've just said, suggest, well, early on, they suggested 13 different possible explanations. And it was weird. I think it was more common at the time, putting lots of explanations, lots of potential explanations for experimental findings. So if you read his original 1963 paper, you'll see these 13 with like 2-3 sentences each. But he kind of then came on to emphasize, particularly in his 1974 book, agentic state. So what's Milgram on about with this? The individual, this is the agentic state notion. In the agentic state, which can be arrived at, especially when you're in an authority subordinate situation, the individual comes to see themselves as an agent for executing the wishes of another person. So it's a situation in which the individual sees themselves as a mere agent for the wishes of the person in charge. And the movement into that state is known as agentic shift. So that's what Milgram came to see, that there's like a psychological transformation through the obedient subordinate situation, through having an authority figure and being subordinate to them. There's the danger of moving into the agentic state, where you see yourself as an agent for executing the wishes of another person. Well, I'd like to move out from our friend Milgram for a moment and then come back in. And I'd like to think about social influence in contemporary society. And here I want to look a little bit about group identities and AI. And I'm particularly interested here in the idea of artificial intelligence and social media and identity bubbles. I'm sure you, like I, have experienced, once you look at a certain thing on Instagram, YouTube, wherever, you might well find that there is more coming towards you of that type. So that's an example of an algorithm at work that's detecting viewing patterns and that is generating further feeds that are relevant to that. This happens across many types of digital media and social media. Goldwitzer got fascinated with this back in 2020. You might remember 2020, very famous for, amongst other things, a global pandemic. Now, Goldwitzer, just have a marvel at the scale of their work for a moment. Goldwitzer et al. 2020 drew on extensive data monitoring actual behavior across 15 million smartphones a day. So that's looking at several data points across 15 million smartphones a day. I mean, I find that extraordinary, to be honest. They argue that the US citizens, so this was based in the US, obviously, responses to COVID-19 are subject to deep and consequential partisan divide, a deep and consequential partisan divide. That's their finding. Let's just have a look at the headline figures here. The partisan divide, as I'm sure you knew, is Democrat versus Republican. So Democrats, when asked about whether they felt they will get COVID and require hospitalization in April 2020, 62% thought they might. That went up to 64% in June 2020. Republicans started at 47%, went down to 35% when they thought about the risks to themselves. When looking at another issue, which is that you might unknowingly spread COVID-19 to others, the Democrats in April 2020, 74% of those thought they might, rising slightly to 77% in June 2020. The Republicans were at 58% in April 2020, falling to 45% in June 2020. So it's extraordinary that the two parties had different thoughts about the risks to themselves and their risks to others concerning COVID-19. And that over time, between April 2020, June 2020, a peak growth of the danger of COVID-19 in the US at that point, over time, that gap got even wider. And it seemed that what mattered wasn't your age or state of health or particular risk factors or what. The key thing that seemed to matter was, are you Democrat or are you Republican? Kaikkonen gave a way of making sense of these sort of data. They suggest that social media enables us to encounter information that reflects our views and to interact with others who share and validate our identities. So if you think of the algorithms shaping what is sent to us, what we see on our phones, that can lead to what's called social bubbles, where we keep getting news and ideas and access to groups and information and opinions that are conforming to our viewing habits. And this increases the distance between groups and decreases the likelihood of finding common ground. That's one of the problems. And it's sometimes with dangerous consequences. It can close us, even when it's important national health or world health information, it can close us to reality if we do not hear it from our group. If our group happens to be a more skeptical group, we might close our minds to whatever evidence or ideas are out there, regardless of how true it is. We might decide in advance that if our group has said it, it must be true. If it's not coming from our sources of social media and news and so on, then it can't be true. And this is the idea of these bubbles, these identity bubbles. Okay, so let's think of another dimension here: influencers, rhetoric, and ideology. As you know, probably much better than me, there's a lot of social media influencers. I was looking at some of the numbers. I was astounded to see Ronaldo, Messi, Gomez, many others having more than 500 million subscribers. They measure not just number of subscribers, but the conversion rate of subscribers to content that's added and their engagement with content that's added and so on. But I think maybe their influence, the influence of influencers, goes a little bit deeper than just persuading me to buy or drink Diet Coke or to use Fenty Beauty lip balm. And it might go a lot deeper. And there's been quite a lot of research into this. So one of the ideas is this notion of an ideal body or ideal looks or an ideal outlook, even ideal beliefs. This sort of perfect me or me as I should be is very much reinforced in a lot of the work of the influencers, maybe unwittingly in most cases. And there's also another thing. at a more fundamental level, perhaps. And this is something that Fuchs 2020 looks at, the ideology that consumption and fame increases our happiness, that being famous, having a big following, or having a lot of disposable income, or buying a lot of things increases our happiness. And this is a fundamental and very, very widely held belief, but it's a sort of belief that influences and shapes people's behavior, but it isn't often reported. If someone was asked, what are your beliefs? They wouldn't necessarily say, oh, I believe fame is really important, money is important, it's important to buy a lot of things as soon as you can, as quickly as you can. People don't usually report it like that, but their behavior suggests that these are fundamental beliefs. Okay, so we're coming up to poll question number 2. I'll just read this one out for you, if I may. What is the Internet Research Agency? What is the Internet Research Agency? Is it an AI tool designed to facilitate search engine optimization? Is it a famous troll farm? Is it an institute focused on the social psychology of the internet? Or is it an institute focused on research into all aspects of the internet? It'd be great to hear your thoughts about this one before we go further. Just give a moment for our figures to come in there. Okay, so I think our data is in, so I'm going to have to adjust my glasses to see that. I need to get reading glasses. Okay, so in last place, we have an AI tool designed to facilitate search engine optimization. No one went for that one. Well done, you're all right on that one. In third place, we have an institute focused on the social psychology of the internet. 14% went for that one. In second place, a famous troll farm, 29% went for that. And most of you have gone for an institute focused on research into all aspects of the internet. 57% went for that one. Well, I've got to tell you, my friends, that the right answer only got 29%, but it is a famous troll farm. So thank you very much for taking part in that. And I think we probably want to find out a bit more about this Internet Research Agency. Here's a picture of it. I've got to say, this is one of the nicest pictures. This is a beautifully taken picture, actually. It's not an attractive building, but the lighting here is wonderful. It's on the outskirts somewhere of St. Petersburg. And it's just one of many different types of troll farms. So this is the Internet Research Agency. It is the troll farm, and it is a fairly famous one. And I think this speaks to the issue of influencers, rhetoric, ideology, and the power of discord. If you've heard the notion fake news, if you've heard that expression, I'm sure we all have, then in a way, you could say that troll farms, their job is to generate news, to generate opinion, to inform where things go. But some of that relies on challenging authorities, challenging ideas that are seen by those running the troll farm as negative or problematic, and also fragmenting. I think that's a really key point that I want to come back to. I've put up here on this slide, Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, because that's one of the things that this our friends here in the Internet Research Agency were involved in doing, creating fake Facebook accounts, many of them, not just one or two Facebooks, loads, thousands of Facebook accounts. And they created a lot that were focused on Black Lives Matter and a lot focused on Blue Lives Matter. One of the things that they did there, building credible characters on the social media sites, but also creating conflicting media sites to encourage division, suspicion, and conflict. In the case of the Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter, for example, they would often try and create demonstrations on the same day to generate conflict. And Constantino 2020 talks about this these deliberately manufactured sites were used to create conflict, and that this weaponized relativism, in a way, it's a quite sophisticated way of having impact. It's not just arguing your agenda, which is one thing, but one of the snags of that is it's easy to spot and people can react against it. But how about if you create such confusion that you can't tell where truth is, and you're just in this world of conflicting ideas, and then some quite insidious ideas might wind up having more influence. An example of that is the fake news is everywhere concept. If you think it's fake everywhere, then some big lies can slip by because they're just, part of the overall thing. Of course, you're suspicious of this, you're suspicious of everything, because it's all fragmented and conflicted. I'm going to pick on one unusual, perhaps, example of what I'd call a possibly insidious ideology, and this is the trust the tech idea. And I'm going to go situate it in terms of AI. I'm not against AI. I do build a lot of chatbots and so on. I think in used creatively and critically, it can be very positive. Surely AI has to be right. Well, Amazon thought that in 2018. And as you may know, they hit a major recruitment problem. And the problem that they hit was that the recruitment tool, the AI recruitment tool they were using, had a very marked gender bias. If you were female, or you mentioned going to a female college or being part of a women's rugby team, is one of the examples I give, then you might have a problem being hired at Amazon. They fixed it subsequently, but this is just to indicate that if we trust the tech, if we have the idea that tech is best, then we might not spot some of the errors that creep in. Another example, this trust the tech has come up with issues around medical facilities, the distribution of medical care. Birmingham et al. 2020, one of many researchers to identify issues here and to talk about the importance of human involvement. And skin cancer diagnosis has been one of the things. And part of the problem was, amongst others, that the training data that the AI used wasn't used to dealing with different pigmentations. And so people with darker pigmentations requiring help, requiring further appointments to look in terms of possible risk of skin cancer, were not getting the help that they needed. There was a skewed unintentional bias there coming in because of the training data. So I just wanted to wonder aloud, really, whether this trust the tech idea is still a potent ideology. And alas, it's not as simple as say that we just learned from our mistakes. I noticed that just a few weeks ago, more or less the time that the book that we were referring to earlier, such psychology texts earlier, was published, MIT published this, AI on police body cams. So you might know, you're probably very familiar with the idea that many police forces, certainly in the US, which is where this is based, wear body cams. So you can see that as protecting police and public in different ways and so on. But there's a new twist to this. So some AI is being used to process the data that's recorded. Now, this is a more than $20 billion industry. It's massive, okay? It can save an enormous amount of time. Imagine someone having to watch through all that's been recorded. Imagine someone having to write a report on all that's been recorded, or to watch it through to find the bits that are important. How about you get AI to do that? Isn't that a good idea? Well, you can see it as being a time-saving idea and an efficiency idea, but there were problems. There were issues around hallucinations. There are issues around biases and accuracy that were coming in. And this is very similar to what has been found in other work, looking at AI used in crime detection type scenarios, such as scanning faces at airports and trying to work out what they're thinking, feeling, planning, intending. Right, 2023, many researchers concerned about digital emotion detection. That's what this is called, digital emotion detection, using AI to detect emotion, somewhat based on some of Ekman's work. Podolets 2023, there's increasingly widespread use of this despite the limitations found in 2022. AI can perpetuate, intensify, and amplify systemic racism and related inequalities. I think that's a warning to all of us. And one of the things I'd say here is that the biggest danger is not just that AI can go wrong, but we might have, as professionals, as members of the general public, people on a jury, people in the justice system, we might have unrealistic faith that AI will be accurate, and it's not always the case. Okay, so let's come back then with some of these thoughts to engage in a few quick questions of our friend here, Milgram. So Griggs and Whitehead talk about the importance. Current social psychology textbooks present Milgram studies as an uncontentious classic with no coverage of the recent criticisms and little coverage of the older ones. That's not entirely true of all textbooks, as I hope you'll find if you turn to chapter 14 of the textbook that we've been referring to in this webinar. I'm going to have to move swiftly through because I do want to allow time for questions, but I do just want to go through some of the interpretations of Milgram's work that show, that resonate with what we looked at when we're looking at wider social influence issues. We mentioned something about social identity groups and identity bubbles. Well, that's what our friends here are saying, Haslam and Riker. It's not obedience, it's group identities. What are they saying? They're saying that an important insight into Milgram's work is that if you look at where the experimenter and the participant are in the room and where the learner is, that impacts levels of obedience. There is more obedience when the participant when the learner receiving the shocks is not even in sight or hearing. If you can't hear them talk, but you can only hear them bang on the wall, there's massively high levels of obedience. When you can hear them talk and shout, that's experiment 5, which we've been focused on, then it drops from very, very high in the 90s and beyond to 63%. But if you bring them into the same room, then it falls markedly, as we saw before. You get very significant lower levels of obedience, around the 30s or so levels of obedience, when you've got to hold the learner's hand down for them to receive the shock. They're in the room. And what Riker and Haslam are saying, it's about identity. The further away someone is, the less I feel they're part of my group. The me and the experimenter forming a group, the learner receiving the shocks is out there. In the earliest experiments, can't see or hear anything from them. In a later experiment, hear them banging kind of what they're saying. In the one we looked at, I can hear what they're saying, but I can't see them. When you can see them, when you can touch them, it really starts to fall down. And so maybe it's not about obedience in the way that Milgram was thinking with agentic state. Maybe it's about, if they're in my group, I'm not going to harm them to the extent. So if they're in the same room as me, I might feel they're in the same group and I might have lower levels of obedience. If they're far away, it's easy to other them and say they're in a different group. And the other dimension that Riker picked up on 2017 is that if I've got another participant sharing this with me, having these instructions and being in the same dilemma with me, then I'm much more empowered to resist whatever I'm being told. So it's this consensus. Again, it's like forming a micro group, a consensus of me and others resisting together. Our friend here, Gibson, is saying that it's not obedience, it's rhetorical persuasion. Let's have a really quick look at what Gibson is saying here. He did a rhetorical analysis. How is it, Gibson asked, that, yeah, many obeyed, but quite a substantial minority managed to disobey? If you look at this, what do you notice? I wonder whether, like me, you see something of an argument. There is no permanent tissue damage. I understand that statement, but I don't understand why the experiment is placed above the person's life. There is no permanent tissue. Okay. Well, that's your opinion. If he doesn't want to continue, I'm taking orders from him. And, you know, so we're getting this back and forth argument. If this were Russia, maybe, but not in America. These were the prods as they're supposed to be used, although it did vary from this. Please continue, or please go on was the first prod. The experiment requires that you continue was the second prod. It's absolutely essential that you continue was the third prod. You have no other choice, you must go on was the fourth prod. Gibson said, if we look at these, they're not actually, apart from the last one, you have no other choice, you must continue. They don't actually sound like orders, but they sound more like arguments. Please continue, that's a request. The experiment requires, it's essential, that implies it's essential for the experiment. Those two are arguments, they're not orders. You have no other choice is the order. And as Griggs suggests in a partial replication, the order, the one that was the most order-like, which is this, you have no other choice, you must go on, was not obeyed. Not a single participant in their partial replication continued when they were told you have no other choice, you must go on. Okay, so very quickly then, I'd like to just move into our final poll. Poll number 3. What do you think Milgram's secret is? Because I'd better get to that before we end our time together. Do you think that Milgram, what do you think Milgram's secret is? Let me run through the options. He was a secret agent acting for the US. He was a secret agent acting for the then USSR. He failed to publish some findings. He inflated his obedience figures by an average of 13%. Okay, so we've got some votes in already on this. And I can see that it looks, as I see it, that no one is going for the secret agent. I'll be honest with you, I had hoped I'd fool a couple of people with the secret agent idea. That did not work out. What I'm seeing here is that, this is very good actually, well done. He inflated obedience figures by an average of 13%, 43% went for that. Just to reiterate, no one went for secret agent for the US, no one went for secret agent for the USSR. Inflated figures by an average of 13%, 43% went for that, and 57% in top place got it right. He failed to publish some findings. Very well done. So give yourself a very well-deserved pat on the back for that one. Excellent. I'm just going to quickly cover strain reducing mechanisms. Russell said that thing, and we touched on it really briefly, about telling the participants it's a science experiment into learning, looking at the effect of punishment on learning, was designed to get people over the kind of resistance of administering electric shock to others. So that was actually a really important thing. And that's what Russell points out, that that was introduced as what's called a strain reducing mechanism. Telling people it's for the good of science may well have helped with their obeying, contributing to the greater good. Let's get into the core. I can tell you're wanting to find out more. What is Milgram's secret? Well, guys, you're absolutely right. Credibility and incredulity in Milgram's obedience experiments. A reanalysis of an unpublished text. Let's find out a little bit more. Perry et al. 2020. Note contradictory evidence that participants in many conditions were confronted with. There's a protest from the participant and reassurance from the experimenter. Participants' calibration of the pain they are causing is likely to take account of what the participant is saying, banging on the wall and shouting, "Let me out of here," and what the experimenter is saying. Both bits of information are coming together and colliding. And here we have it, the unpublished study. Perry et al., all these years later on, after that, nearly 60 years later, discussed the findings of an unpublished study by Milgram's assistant, Takito Murata. Credibility and incredulity in Milgram's obedience experiments and reanalysis of an unpublished test was what Perry et al. Published in 2020. Murata's research involved measuring participants in terms of their belief and how their belief that they were causing pain related to the level of shock that they administered. Participants who fully believed they were causing pain gave lower shocks. Those who did not fully believe they were causing pain gave higher shocks. And so that, as many of you guessed, is Milgram's secret. That we've got these fabulous findings, this fascinating experiment, but that we've got a bit of the picture that wasn't published, that was hidden, that didn't quite fit the story. And that bit of the picture suggests there might be this other ingredient about credibility and belief. That maybe one of those early things that participants didn't believe they were administering shocks could have been a big factor in shaping what happened and what we found. I'm going to end with a couple of quick thoughts. I think we should be curious. That's what one of the closing thoughts I want to give you, and even about the classics, not just being curious and questioning about other things, but also about the classic studies as well. And I think that's what Griggs and Whitehead and Griggs are saying there. I think we should be curious about the whole phenomena of social influence. And amongst many other things, it helps us in terms of political awareness, social awareness, and so on, well-being. It also helps us to understand contemporary phenomena that we're experiencing, being curious about social influence. And I think being curious about social influence helps us in another way. It helps us not only to understand and account for the phenomena in our world, but to think critically about what we're encountering, the technology, the information, the ideas. To think critically is one of the greatest skills we can have and develop. And I think being curious is the seed for that. I'm going to end with the words of A.S. Byatt, though many, many others have shared this sentiment. I think the virtue I prize above all others is curiosity. And I think social psychology can offer us many things. And one of the great things it can do is to help sustain, develop, and support our curiosity. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Paul. Absolutely fascinating insight into social psychology. And I love the way that you've kind of finished on that part about curiosity and the critical thinking and the importance of that. So I wanted to now pass on and give the opportunity for participants to ask questions. So we had a couple of questions. I'd like to encourage participants to use the Q&A function if you have any questions for Paul at this point. But we did also have a couple of questions come in before the webinar. And so we wanted to start with those just to kick us off. Okay, so Paul, how can we tackle the negative influence by using AI itself was the first question.
Right, thank you very much. So the negative influence, potential negative influence of AI. I think this is a really important question. And I think one of the reasons that critical thinking is so important is that we need to be aware of the limitations of AI. I think that's a key point there. So I believe it's important that we use AI in a way that's creative and ethical and critical as well. I think one of the problems that I see that I think I touched on there, and I do touch on in the book as well, is this idea that somehow it having the status of being AI, we see how fantastic it is and the amazing things it can do so much more quickly than we can do. But we can have an undue faith in it. And if you kind of lift up the hood and look at how it's working, it's doing an amazing job, but it is kind of solving things more or less as a sort of mathematical problem in a multidimensional space. You know, it's finding likely predicted associated clusters of words together, and it's kind of cobbling together something mathematically, really, and in terms of predictive probability. So it's not acting in a meaningful and intelligent way to that extent. And that means it's great, it's wonderful, quick. It can add to and enhance what we do, but we've got to think it's only as good as the training data that it's been trained and developed on, and that it like any person or any machine that is resourced using flawed human input is going to be flawed as well. Now, there are ways of developing AI so that it overcomes some of those limitations. I think increasingly people are using databases so that they curate the knowledge that AI is working on. So that's like retrieval augmented generation. And I think those methods do help, but it's a human trained machine, and it's working mathematically and probabilistically with these data, and so it will generate erroneous data much of the time. I think having that critical awareness is the most important thing we can do.
Thank you. I think there's another question in the chat. Maria, are you happy to take that one?
Yeah, I can take that one. It kind of relates to what you were just saying about credibility and us knowing what to expect from AI. So the question says, the world needs more social psychology, which I think we all can agree on. But the question is, can we overcome our exaggerated faith in technology, given the big business machine that keeps promoting it? What do you think?
I think I'd just give another twist to avoid giving the same sort of answer again. One of the things I think I'd recommend is the more we can customize, use, adapt, change, and be creative with the technology, the more we can make it. The more, if it's like a closed box and we're just using whatever the big companies are giving to us without questioning, I think that's problematic. But the more we can take control of this and be involved in creating and developing and using the technology for ourselves and others for good purposes, the more we're creatively involved, the better, I think. Then we can see where its shortcomings are more clearly, but we can also have control over it rather than feeling that we're always a consumer of something that's being forced upon us. So I would claim it for yourselves, really, I think is part of my answer there.
Great, thank you. So the next pre-submitted question was, how do you think social psychology can overcome war and environmental degradation? So quite a big question.
Wow. I mean, that is such a massive question. One of the things that we briefly looked at in our webinar today was this thing about like social bubbles. And I think if you look at that, that's a means by which people are driven apart. We also looked at the way in which troll farms can also drive people apart. So it's creating division and reducing the possibility of people listening to one another or meaningfully encountering other ideas that might challenge where they stand. So I think we've got to look at the social psychology of division to understand what dividing practices are. And I think what the legitimizing discourses are that legitimize inequality and division, that might promote and generate conflict, what is happening. So social psychology can bring a lens to the mechanisms of division and conflict. And I don't just mean that in terms of trying to explain why people are aggressive, but why people come to other each other. So I'm going to say that one of the key phenomena here is the notion of othering, how we come to see my group is different to your group, me is different to you, and out of that othering, so much conflict, denigration of the other can emerge. And I think social psychology can look at the mechanisms, often through the talk, the ideologies, the group identities, the dividing practices that are involved in that. And if we challenge the othering and the division, I think we're at least making a tiny step towards overcoming some of the conflict.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul. I think, yeah, that's such a packed question, isn't it? And it's very pressing to discuss something like that. Moving away from the big topics here, we had a question about, so the book is full of learning features to help students think critically and put social psychology to practice. But do you have any tips on how can faculty use those learning features and make the most of them to help their students?
Yeah, well, I'd say that I've been teaching social psychology a very long time indeed. I now just say more than 25 years. So there are additional resources. For one, there's a question bank, there's PowerPoint slides, there's a teaching resource guide. And in that, I have tried to distill what I found has worked for many, many years, and also how I've updated my approach and my material to deal with the contemporary landscape. I think each chapter starts with a case, you know, there's a contemporary case that should hopefully have some resonance in terms of contemporary society. There's in the news features that again plug into things that are going on around us. There are try it out boxes which encourage students to try the ideas, test themselves, think through the phenomena that are being discussed, and those work well in seminar and workshop context. And as you've alluded to, I think throughout not just each chapter, but every single section of every chapter in the book, there is a critical review. There's a kind of thinking critically about the material that's been covered. And I built this in because I just found a frustration. I found that there was insufficient support. I thought we could do more to support our students to be critical by giving them not just the information, but also giving them some further scaffolding, some further support and encouragement and inspiration to think critically about the material that we've covered. I think these are important learning tools, and whether that's in more of a lecture type presentation or a seminar or workshop, thinking in a critical way is a very important dimension of that. And I think the book, with the faculty, I think working together with students and the faculty, I think with the pedagogical resources that I've referred to, and the whole flavor of drawing on different perspectives, looking at any phenomena from different perspectives and questioning those perspectives, I think those are resources for discussion and dissemination.
Moving now back to the kind of classical theories. So there's a question here about, should we still be studying Milgram and also Zimbardo given the ethical and research integrity issues?
Brilliant. I think this is a very good question indeed. And it's one that I had very much when I was writing the book, this edition, more than the first edition. First edition, I think there were ethical considerations. Those came out quite early for both Milgram and Zimbardo. But in 2018 onwards, a further wave of questions came out about research integrity regarding Zimbardo. I did reflect really quite hard on this, and I thought it's best that we discuss these classics in terms of all of the data that's going on. So there are ethical issues, but by discussing those ethical issues, we can learn from what's gone on, you know, and there's maybe not just hiding and just giving a kind of distorted view of social psychology in the past. You know, we have kind of done things that I think will be done very differently now, if at all. And I think bringing that into the light is quite important in terms of the honesty of our scientific history. So I think that's one reason. So to discuss and to address isn't just to endorse. If done in the right spirit, I think it is also to question and to learn from. I think we can do that in terms of the ethics in particular. In terms of the scientific integrity, I think it is important that we address what's going on there in terms of the integrity of the ideas. I think there is important literature. Some of the literature that's questioned Milgram and Zimbardo is really important to, it shines a very interesting light on what has gone on. The Milgram secret that we were looking at in this webinar, for example, that provides a case of that. And it does cast an interesting light in terms of this phenomenon. It gives us a space from which we can rethink. And similarly with Zimbardo's work, I think the Texia and others, 2018 onwards, started to shine a light on some of these things that were going on that would make us think again in terms of research credibility and integrity, as well as ethics. So by engaging critically with the classic study and the recent criticism, I think we are giving future generations of social psychologists resources for thinking carefully and thinking well about the discipline.
I just wanted to give the participants a chance to add another question into the Q&A box if they'd like to. Otherwise, we'll move to our final question. I don't see anything coming up, so I just wanted to ask this final question. So what do you hope that this book will ultimately achieve? Paul?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you. When I think about this, I do reflect on how I interacted with social psychology texts as a student, and some of the value that I got from that, and some of the inspiration that I got from that. And I think in particular, I think the work of Roger Brown was quite influential on me. As I read it, I felt that I was connecting with Roger Brown, that it's almost like having a tutorial with him. I felt inspired by it. I felt here was someone who was thinking through and showing me how the ideas applied to the world around me. And here was someone who seemed to be supporting some measure of thinking critically about the ideas. And I got a strong sense of the relevance and the kind of intellectual interest of the ideas that were being discussed. So what I would like to achieve maybe is something similar to that. I'd like it to help empower students in their journey in social psychology. I'd like it to empower students to be able to apply the ideas to the contemporary world, to be able to feel aware of both the contemporary and the classic work in social psychology, and to be able to think critically about the ideas that they encounter. Now, if it does those, I'd be absolutely thrilled and delighted.
Thank you, Paul. I think that's a really, really fantastic place to finish. And thank you to everyone who joined us today, and to Paul especially for such a really interesting discussion, and yeah, just absolutely fascinating. So don't forget as well about the 25% discount code on Paul's book. And if you'd like to find out more about the book, please visit bit.ly/Dickerson2E. The webinar is going to be finishing very soon, but thank you all and have a lovely day.
Take care.